Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for Citizens Climate Lobby's Big Tent Climate Talks. This is a conversation in a quarterly series that spotlights leaders in the climate community. At CCL, we know that solving climate change requires a variety of policies and perspectives. This is why we do our work under a big tent. That includes folks from the right, the left, and every spot in between. In our Big Tent episodes, we'll talk to a wide variety of climate leaders outside of CCL to learn more about how we can all work together in this space better. For those of you who don't know, I'm Kyle Kammien, and I'm the manager of stakeholder engagement and government affairs here at CCL. My work focuses on building the coalition of partners in our Big Tent and advocating for legislation. For our episode today, CCL is beyond pleased to be hosting a conversation with Bill McKibben to discuss some of his most recent work, founding a new climate organization called Third Act. I also want to acknowledge and thank Dr. Eric Miller and the CCL Bloomsburg chapter in Pennsylvania for their help setting up today's conversation. But before I introduce Bill, I want to do a few gentle reminders on our ground rules. As CCLers, we love our focus and we're open-minded. Today's focus is on listening and learning from the perspectives of fellow climate advocates. If you bump into a moment where a reaction where someone shares something you think or feel differently about, lean into it, see it as an opportunity to learn about the larger climate movement and better understand that perspective. Learning from each other and working together is really how we're going to get this job done. So with that, I will introduce today's guest, someone I imagine many of you are very familiar with. Bill is a contributing writer to The New Yorker and a founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. He founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. He's also won the Gandhi Peace Award and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He has written over a dozen books about the environment, including his first, The End of Nature, published in 1989, as the first book on global warming written for a general audience. Bill, given your prominence in the climate movement, I imagine many of our guests are very familiar, but is there anything that you'd like to add to that maybe we missed in the bio or anything like that?
Only that I've gotten over the years to do lots of work with CCL and various chapters of it over the years. I think I was the guest on what may have been almost the very first national call that CCL did long time ago. And I've admired and helped where I could over the years. And I've been particularly happy to see that my old friend and 350 colleague Madeline Pera has risen to the absolute apex of CCL. You couldn't do better than her. And I got to see her and give her a big hug of congratulations not long ago. So that made me very happy.
Well, that's terrific. I know we're very excited as staff to have Madeline leading us. She's a terrific leader, and I think is going to do great things as our leader here at CCL. Well, with that said, I'll stop talking. We'll jump into the questions. I just wanted to note for the audience that we've saved some time at the bottom of the hour to handle audience Q&A. So for this part of the conversation, I'll be asking Bill some questions that we've already canned to start up the conversation. And then the back half of the hour, we'll go through audience questions. So please, don't be afraid to put those in the chat, and I will get through them later. So Bill, the first question we had for you is, can you tell the audience a little bit about the why behind Third Act and how you personally, got involved in the climate movement and how that's led to Third Act?
How I got involved in the climate movement is basically the story of my life. When I was in my mid-20s, I wrote The End of Nature, which was the first book about climate change. Came out in 1989, and people read it all over the place. It was in 24 languages and things. I think in those days, I conceived of what we were doing as an argument that we needed to win. And so being a good writer and academic and things, I published more books, organized symposiums, gave many talks, so on and so forth. At a certain point, maybe 10 years on, it became clear to me that we'd won the argument. There was no doubt about what was going on with climate change, we were just losing the fight because the fight wasn't about data or reason or policy or anything else. The fight was about what fights are almost always about: money and power. And the fossil fuel industry had so much money and hence so much power that though they'd lost the argument, they were showing no signs of losing the fight. And that's when some of us decided that really it was time to start organizing to build movements that could stand up to some of that power and really force some change. So 350.org, which I started in about 2006 with a bunch of college students here at Middlebury College in Vermont, where I teach, turned into the first sort of iteration of a global climate movement. We've organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on the planet except North Korea at this point, Kyle. And we sort of spearheaded the fight about the Keystone Pipeline that became the first defeat for big oil and sort of spawned happily opposition to every pipeline and frack well and LNG terminal and everything else. And then we launched the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which has become the largest campaign of its kind in history. We're at about $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. Very good mood today because Princeton University became the latest to announce that they were divesting their $37 billion endowment about an hour ago. Princeton almost completes the Ivy League, I think, but it's also Oxford and Cambridge and the University of California and the University of Michigan. It's most of the big religious denominations, many of the biggest pension funds in the world, on and on and on. And all those things have been terrific. But the best part of it was that the movement, many others followed us into this work of trying to build movements and make change. CCL clearly among them.
Yes.
And as I say, Madeline was an early organizer at 350 Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I got to know her. I can remember sitting on her back porch as we plotted strategy in Madison. Many of the people, if not most of the people that followed us into this work and have been doing this work are young people. And that's terrific. The young people from the divestment campaigns, when they graduated from college, having fought for divestment from fossil fuel, many of them went on to form this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal, and who turned out to be among the savviest political players in Washington. They're really, I think, more responsible than anybody else for the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of the boiled down version of the Green New Deal. It was Varshini Prakash, their leader, who was who along with John Kerry and Gina McCarthy formed the kind of working group that Biden set up in order to come up with his climate legislation before he took office. Varshini was the person who had divested UMass Amherst. And then, of course, young people all over the planet joined behind Greta Thunberg. Greta is one of my favorite people in the world. I love working with her. I just had an email from her the day before yesterday, sort of just catching up and thinking about the future. But she would be the first to say that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs around the planet. There really are, junior high and high school students everywhere. They've got about 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on climate strike in September of 2019. And I love all those efforts. The only thing I'd begun to worry about was a few too many people I heard saying, well, this is up to the next generation to get this job done, which struck me as both ignoble and impractical. Impractical because young people, for all their energy, ambition, intelligence, idealism, lack the structural power to make change that we need. And I think that it's people like me, Kyle, over the age of 60, who have a large role to play in helping bring that change about. large role to play because there are 70 million of us in this country.
Yeah.
It's larger than the population of France. We punch above our weight politically, even from those numbers, because we vote in such high percentage. There's no known way to keep old people from voting. And we ended up with most of the money too.
Right.
There's about 70% of the country's financial assets belong to the baby boomers or the silent generation.
Yeah.
And so if we want to move Washington or we want to move Wall Street, then it seems like a good idea to get some people with hairlines like mine engaged in this fight. And that's what's been happening. In the last 6 or 8 months, people by their tens of thousands have been flooding in to help. And we've begun to mount campaigns and get work done that I think we've got plenty to work on for the years ahead.
I think two things. One, it's fascinating to listen to you talk about kind of the history of the climate movement as you've seen it evolving. And the second is, it is very clear the outsized influence that generation, those generations that you're talking about, have in the political process and kind of the power structure of U.S. politics. And so, one of the things that kind of leads me to is thinking about, what Third Act wants to focus on in its efforts. What are some of the projects and areas of focus, related to climate, particularly for our conversation's purposes, but that, Third Act is really,
Sure.
starting to lean into and hopes to lean into?
Sure. There's two areas that we're working hard on, and they strike me as the two areas that people our age may have sort of taken for granted. One, which I'll get back to, and the thing that's closest to my heart, are these questions around the physical stability of the planet, which is obviously now in question. And the other is around the stability of our democracies. I mean, if you'd told me when I was 20 that, the polar ice caps would quickly be melting and we'd be, the sea level would be up a foot, I would have told you that was obviously lunacy and impossible, because no one had ever even imagined that such a thing could happen. Similarly, if someone had told me that, thousands of people would be storming the nation's capital and killing police officers in order to stop the counting of votes, I would have told you that was impossible too, that America was not a country like that. But as it turns out, those things are possible. And so we're working hard on the democracy front and trying to preserve voting rights and make sure that we don't slip into something different here. But on climate, we're doing several things. One is trying hard to support this legislative process. We did a lot of work around the IRA, and then I was down in Washington the day before yesterday, working on this side deal that Manchin tossed in with our colleagues who've been fighting pipelines and things across the Appalachians. But truthfully, I think that our guess is that there may not be as many opportunities in the next 2 years for federal progress. We'll see what happens in the election, but it may not be. And truthfully, one place where I've perhaps disagreed with CCL's analysis over the years is I've never really thought there was much hope that we'd get the Republican Party buy-in to change. So if Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy are back in control of the show, I don't think we're going to get much climate action. I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But in any event, we'll keep working hard to make it happen there and on the states, but we're not going to rest on that. We also think that there's a very important role to be played in taking on Wall Street, as it were. I think that there are two levers big enough to pull that matter in the climate debate. One's marked politics, and we've all pulled that one pretty far to the floor. And the other's marked money. And we've done some of that, but not enough. So one of the campaigns we're fully embarked on now is to take on the big banks. The 4 big American banks, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, are also the 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry in the world. They keep the spigot, the money pipeline running to these guys, allowing them to continue to drill in the Arctic, build new pipelines, and not coincidentally, purchase congressmen, which they've done very effectively for a long time. And so we're doing our best to take them on. First round is a campaign to get people to pledge to cut up their credit cards from these banks by next spring if they haven't begun to change. And the day when we cut them up is going to be a exciting and fun one all across America. We've got a lot of good things in mind and a lot of partners joining in because we deeply believe in coalitional work.
Is that the Bug the Banks campaign? Is that the Bug the Banks campaign?
Yeah, and we're calling it Banking on Our Future, and what it'll morph into eventually, really probably sooner rather than later, is also an effort to pressure, city and state treasurers to put pressure on banks and also big companies. This has gotten very interesting. I did a piece for the New Yorker 3 years ago to the sort of start of some of this work had the long title, Money is the Oxygen on Which the Fires of Global Warming Burn. And we've gotten a more detailed analysis of that in the last few months, Kyle. A wonderful group of researchers finally published a series of reports that allow us for the first time to really document what the carbon contribution of cash in the bank is. We've always known there is one. In fact, the official worksheets that companies fill out to quantify their carbon emissions has a place under the Scope 3 emissions for just this calculation, but no one's ever filled it out because there was never a methodology to do it. Now there is. And the numbers are really shocking. In this New Yorker piece, we showed that, for instance, Netflix produces more money from its carbon in the bank than it does from all the TV shows that people watch around the world every night. Amazon's carbon emissions from their cash are higher than all their delivery vans and warehouses combined. And for those of us who have a little money in the bank, it turns out that if you have 125 grand in the American banking system, it's probably producing more carbon as it's being lent out for pipelines and things than all the cooking, flying, heating, driving, cooling that the average American does in the course of a year. So this is not a trivial pressure point. It's an important one. And we think that, as time goes by, we'll have the support, say, of those big companies. Google, Apple, whatever, have all pledged to go net zero, right, but they can't do it if they, if their money is out there spinning carbon. The treasurer of the comptroller of the city of New York, who has a lot of cash flow in his operation, said a couple of weeks ago that this is time to start taking this seriously and putting some pressure on these guys to change. So that's the work that one of the pieces of this that will be about. And it's great fun because we're doing it in collaboration with all kinds of young people. Kyle, I was just up at a demonstration outside a Chase Bank office, and there were a couple of hundred high school kids there because high school kids completely get this. And being somewhat sprier, they were at the front of the march, but behind them there was a large group of us, a big group of older people marching under a banner that said, fossils against fossil fuels. So we're doing it in the best spirit that we can.
No, that is it sounds like you had good fun with that. That's great. And a good partnership opportunity with that group of young people as well, as they were working on that effort. There was a lot there, and I think we can certainly appreciate the work that you all did to support the IRA. That was something that we generated a lot of calls to congressional offices, et cetera, trying to get that across the finish line as well. And as you mentioned on the federal progress component, we're going to need to see what the next Congress looks like. There's no doubt, before we can really peg and what the opportunities will be,
what
there.
The strategy is. That's exactly right.
And so
we're working hard to try and shape the next Congress as we're going along. So that's fun and important work too.
And CCL partnered with Environmental Voter Project and is really pushing our volunteers' resources to be able to engage with Environmental Voter Project and help people turn out to vote. So that's certainly an effort on our part as well. Well, and on that note, what are some thoughts that you have on how Third Act's efforts and CCL can best be in the movement together? What are some of the ways that you think CCL can be most helpful on Third Act's priorities on the climate space?
Well, certainly for individual members, just joining in to take this banking pledge is very helpful. And it's the kind of thing that I'm noting in the chat. It's fun to watch people saying that they started the Lehigh Valley chapter after where I was plugging CCL, and that makes me happy because it's something I've routinely done for a long time. This is something that chapters could easily work on too. It's not an extraordinarily time-consuming. The day that we do this sort of cutting up of credit cards can be a lot of fun. We're going to have people underwater on dying coral reefs, and we've got all too many illustrations of what we're talking about at the moment, and I'm afraid we have a lot more today than we did yesterday. Pictures from Fort Myers, the pictures from Port Charlotte, the pictures from Cape Coral, the pictures from Tampa Bay are utterly heartbreaking. And one of the things we've said over the years, which is correct, is that climate change hits hardest those who've done the least to cause it, and that's definitely true. But it's not universally true. I mean, that was that Hurricane Ian, riding an extra foot of sea level rise as it surged into those bays, was striking right at the heart of absolutely average America. Yeah. So that's one good way to participate. But another way is just for people to join these all-in calls that we're doing once a month. And they've been lots of fun. One of the it's very, someone asks if there's a platform for helping decide which cards to cut up and which to use, and there is, and we can, sign this pledge and we'll be getting you lots of information going forward. But the thing so far has been lots of fun for people just to play any part in, partly because well, here's a way to say it. People said for a long time that it was useless organizing older people because people became more conservative as they aged, and hence they wouldn't want to work on these things. Mm-hmm. I've never thought that's true, and I think that there's a certain number of older people in the CCL ranks, which I think just proved it, just as there has been at 350 and elsewhere. But the real pleasure has been being reminded that we're not your grandparents' grandparents, the people who are in their 60s and 70s and 80s now, in their first act when we were young, were around for this period of vigorous social, cultural, political transformation that brought us most of if you go look at all the things the Supreme Court's trying to take away, they all come from this period. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act and the EPA of 70-71, Roe v. Wade of 73. If we were going to conserve anything, this is what we'd be conserving, And so it hasn't surprised me, people's reaction. Say what you will about our generation, but we did produce the best music the world's ever seen. And it's been great fun to have Carole King and Neil Young and Patti Smith and Bette Midler and Mandy Patinkin and all these people joining in to help. There's an awful lot of talent in our age group.
No, it's. I think you're absolutely right. There's you pointed out how much transition in the United States that generation was a part of early on, and now can come back to the fore and be a part of trying to create positive change again. So I think that's really incredible. You touched on this in your answer earlier, but it's one of the questions I had lined up. I'm curious if you can give a little more context to what you're thinking. So we recently saw the passage of the IRA, as well as climate investments in the infrastructure law and in the CHIPS Act. But those of us that work in the space, we know that the work isn't done. There's still plenty more that needs to happen. Can you describe what Third Act sees or you see as kind of the next priorities on climate? Now that we've had some wins, we've had some progress. What are the next priorities?
Well, the two things I think that are going to be important now are one, execution. We've now obviously entered a period when the economic forces have changed. A little bit of that's the money that'll come from the IRA. Yeah. An awful lot of it's just the fact that scientists and engineers have so dramatically driven down the cost of renewable energy.
Right.
Solar panels and wind turbines have dropped in price by about 90% in the last decade, which is really quite a miracle.
It's incredible.
And what it means is there's really no longer a big technological or financial obstacle to making rapid change. But that doesn't mean there aren't obstacles. One of those obstacles is just inertia, which is always a large force in human affairs.
Yeah.
We're used to doing things one way, so we need to be pushing, especially state and local officials and things, to just make the kind of changes that are starting to happen. And it's, so California has just announced that there'll be, no internal combustion cars by 2035. And I believe I saw that New York State may have followed that today. Oh, wow. California is set to pass. There'll be no installation of anything of gas heaters or cooktops within a decade. Those are huge changes, and they're going to require all kinds of things to make them work. Among other things, America is short about 1 million electricians at the moment from what we need. So, there's a whole lot of work to be done spinning that up. That execution work's really important. So execution to overcome inertia and action to overcome vested interest. Because, look, the fossil fuel industry, I think, in their heart of hearts, know that their days are numbered, that 40 years from now, we're going to run the world on sun and wind and batteries, and maybe whatever, next generation nuclear technology we develop, or wave energy, or whatever it is. But if it takes us 40 years to get there, Kyle, then the world we run on clean energy is going to be a broken world. So that's what the fossil fuel industry would like, to take as long as possible to spin as much money out of their business model as they can, to get as many of their assets out of the ground before they become stranded. And so our job is to try also to slow down this industry, to politically weaken them, to make it harder to do the right thing. That's been much of my work really for the last 10 years in this divestment work and the work around pipelines and things, and it continues with this work on the financial system. It's the thing that's gotten in the way more than anything else of rational policymaking is the power of the fossil fuel industry. So, if one in the end sits down and asks oneself, why have we not done, say, the extremely obvious step of putting a price on carbon?
Yeah.
Doing so, in the end, it's because the fossil fuel industry made sure it didn't happen, and that was that sad testimony to that fact in that leaked Exxon video last year, where Exxon's chief lobbyist was like, "Yeah, this is, we know this is never going to happen. We can keep it was just a talking point for us," And so I think that if we continue weakening that power, then all things become possible eventually. We shall see. So those are overcoming inertia and overcoming vested interest remain the key things. And in the process of doing both those things, we continue to do the thing that we've done most successfully for the last 10 or 15 years, and that remains key, which is continuing just to shift the zeitgeist in these fights. So every fight we do, win or lose, whether it's about divesting Princeton, or blocking the Keystone Pipeline, or passing a fee and dividend law or anything else. When we lose it or when we win it, just the fact of fighting it lets helps helps change people's sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. And once in a while, I've had friends in CCL just say, "Oh, I feel like we're not getting anywhere because we're very focused on this one project and it hasn't come to pass." And I've always said, no, that's not true. The work that y'all have been doing has been continuing to play an important part in shifting our sense of that zeitgeist. And as we do it, far more becomes possible. The Inflation Reduction Act would not have been possible 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it is possible now because of the work all of us have done to just change the mood nationally. And I will add, it's important to keep doing this work as globally as we can as well. They don't call it global warming.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And thank you for saying that. I know, post IRA, some thinking ahead, thinking about what our priorities will be. It's going to continue to be, a carbon fee and dividend model would still accelerate this change, and that's important. And thinking about what else we can do on the margins in what it could be a divided Congress, is that nature-based climate solutions and some other efforts that we can do there. So those are the kinds of things that, keeping carbon fee and dividend front and center, but these other items that we want to do on the perimeter to keep the conversation going, keep racking up the wins that are positives for the climate.
I think that's very smart thinking. And I do think that remembering that there are power sectors outside of politics, especially in finance, is really important. One of the good things about taking on Wall Street, it's not easy in any way, but when we get wins there, and we've gotten some, two things. One, Wall Street is global in a way that even Washington doesn't really rule the world the way once it did, but Wall Street still kind of does. And two, the other thing that's good about working in the financial sector is hard to move, but when it moves quickly. So if JP Morgan Chase tomorrow said, you know what, we're no longer banking fossil fuel expansion plans, can't get a loan from us anymore, that news would be reflected in every stock market in the world inside of 20 minutes, So there are some, if I were you, if I were people at CCL, I would do a little bit of work in that realm too. It's interesting also, and it draws on other muscles kind of. It's a different set of challenges and different set of possibilities. Among other things, there's one way in which it's strategically and politically a little easier. As you're all too well aware, our political system dramatically favors the status quo between, two senators per state and gerrymandered districts and the filibuster and, dark money and elections and on and on and on. It's, it's the kind of red state model of things. That's why you guys have, tried to go after, get Republicans on board. In the financial world, that's a little different. About 70% of the country's GDP came from counties that voted blue in the last election. So that money is in places where it's somewhat easier to get a hand on. At least people shouldn't give up on these fights before they happen. There's some interesting work to be done.
I think I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of interesting work yet to be done. I want to jump into some questions we've had coming in from volunteers, and I'm going to try and ask them in an order somewhat makes sense. So one that we have is, earlier you were talking about the carbon impact of folks' money in the bank. And the question is saying, can you kind of break that down into the basics? How does the money in the bank create carbon? Is it because it's being lent out in a way that facilitates emissions? And are we talking about, is money in a credit union any less intensive? What kind of things should folks be thinking about?
Good questions. Yes, that's precisely why. It's the capital on which out to the fossil fuel industry, which then uses it to keep. It's not so much people have fewer objections to the, to having some kind of financial relationship going on with the fossil fuel industry. We're obviously not getting off oil tomorrow, sadly. So there needs to, they need to have a banking relationship. But it's the carbon comes, as people measure it, in the commitment to projects that are going to be here for 40 years. I mean, if you're building a new pipeline now, you're expecting to be making money off it for 4 or 5 decades. That's how they're financed, And that's clearly crazy. It's, has nothing to do with what any of the climate scientists are telling us is correct or possible. And yes, chances are that your credit union has less connection to fossil fuel, different probably if you're in Texas or Louisiana, but there's a pretty good chance. There's also beginning to be an emerging series of banks who are getting fairly explicit about not being connected. Some of them are very progressive on these questions. On the East Coast, Amalgamated Bank out of New York. There's also some very large banks that are joining in now in this work. I think that people can look at First Republic Bank in California, one of the 20 biggest banks, has no fossil fuel ties. And for business banking relationships, one of the emerging players is Silicon Valley Bank, 15th biggest bank in the country, obviously deeply connected to the tech sector. And that's probably why they have no strong connections to fossil fuel. So there are good options there.
That's really helpful. And a question that's related. Can you talk a bit about how, as opposed to banks, something like a company that runs mutual funds like a Fidelity or a Vanguard plays in that space?
Sadly, they fit in badly so far. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street are the largest largest holders of fossil fuel, and they've made some good noises, but they lack the courage of whatever convictions they have. This year, Texas and Louisiana barked at the BlackRock guys, and their CEO immediately backed down and stopped. BlackRock wouldn't even vote their shares on obvious climate votes in this year's annual general meeting season. So there's a lot of work to be done there too, and people are doing it. It's not that hard anymore for individuals to find fossil-free funds to join in on. And by the way, all of this is made much easier by the fact that there's no financial penalty to doing the right thing here. The fossil fuel sector has underperformed the rest of the economy for the last decade for reasons that all of us know very well. I mean, it's a technology that's outmoded, and they have a competitor now who can do the same thing cleaner and cheaper. So over the long run, I mean, they'll have boom years like this one where Vladimir Putin helps out and they make some money, but it'd be a good idea to scrub your portfolio. I'm not that I'm an investment manager, take my advice for what it's worth, but I do know a lot about carbon, and I can tell you that at the very least, your portfolio will feel better once it's rid of these guys.
I will tell you on that note, something that I was pleased to see in that kind of back and forth, as you mentioned. The attorneys general in a few red states had fired back about the whole ESG movement and accusing these funds of a number of things. But I think it was just last month, a number of the funds and some blue attorneys general fired back in opposition, and rather than just kind of folding. So I think we're seeing, at least to me, that was an indicator of a bit of a sea change that's happening in that process. Probably not fast enough, but I did think that was kind of indicating the seas changing a bit there.
Exactly right.
Okay, so I have 3 more questions. I know we're close on time, so I want to run through them as quickly as possible. The first one is I think you can answer quickly. The question is, how many chapters of Third Act are there in the U.S. approximately, and how many members approximately?
Tens of thousands of members, somewhere north of 40,000. I truthfully haven't been keeping track, and people are quickly forming chapters and working groups, and they're forming them in 2 ways. One is the obvious geographical one. So there's Third Act Virginia I was just down with those guys outside the Capitol last week, and so on and so forth. But people are also forming working groups based on what they spent their life doing.
Mhm.
So there's a faith working group, largely retired pastors and rabbis and things, or educators, hundreds and hundreds of former teachers. And those are good too because they allow you to bring sectoral pressure to bear and real expertise and credibility to bear. So the Third Act educators are working hard to divest teacher pensions from fossil fuel. And believe me, teacher pensions add up to a large share of the country's money supply. So,
Okay, no, thank you. That's great. The next question is I know a difficult one to answer in a short period of time. This question is, the Washington Post editorial board argues that we need some form of permitting reform in order to build the grid to transport the electricity we need for renewable energy. I would add, there's also the Princeton repeat study. I think it's from Jesse Jenkins that refers
Jesse's
to
work, yeah.
as much as 80% of the emissions reductions for IRA can't be achieved if we don't do something along the transmission path. So the question is, what do you think about, these arguments and this data and kind of what are your parameters that you see as needed on that in this topic?
I think that's right.
Okay.
I think there's no question that we need both permitting reform and a kind of change in our attitude around this stuff. I write this newsletter all the time on Substack called The Crucial Years. And one time this year, I devoted one to really going after my beloved home state of Vermont, which had just turned down a 10-acre solar farm solely on aesthetic grounds. People didn't want to look at it. And I just said, that's it, guys, this is not okay anymore. In a world in as much hurt as we're in, you don't get to say that. What we need to do is figure out a kind of new aesthetic. You need to look at a windmill up on the horizon and think, wow, there's the breeze made visible. And it's beautiful. And it's beautiful in part because it means we're taking responsibility for energy ourselves. So some of that can come from federal permitting reform. And that'll be especially important as regards transmission corridors and transmission lines. Most of it is probably going to have to be done at a state and local level because that's most of the permits and the things that we're talking about.
That's more of the that's more of the NIMBYism kind of challenges.
Yes, as always, state public utility commissions remain one of the most under-organized, under-lobbied, they're hugely powerful, and nobody pays the slightest attention to them. And so utilities routinely capture them, and truthfully, five rear ends in the seats at a state public utility commission hearing are 5 more than were there last month, and you'll get a lot of attention, and it's a good place to make interventions. So, but I think there's all the room too at a federal level for rational permitting reform. It just can't come tied to gift wrapped. This Mountain Valley Pipeline. Look at the thing that Manchin tried to put through that senators like Tim Kaine finally put the kibosh on the other day. It was ludicrous. It directs federal agencies to deliver permits for this thing without conducting review, forbids their appeal in court, and if there are court appeals, it chooses which court they're going to go to because they think they have one circuit with enough Trump appointees that they'll approve anything. That's not how people make policy in a rational world. That's just the raw exercise of power. So I'm glad that side deal is defeated, but glad that it's raised the profile of the need for serious attention to permitting. We're going to have to build a lot of stuff fast. And our the precedents for building a lot of stuff fast are not that great, but there are a few. I wrote a long piece not long ago really detailing what had happened in America in the first year of the Second World War and how it was that we came to manufacture tanks and ships and planes on the scale that we did. And it's a fascinating story. And we need some of that same kind of spirit here. We've got to, if we're going to install clean energy at the pace that science says is required, it's going to take a lot of work.
That's well, that's a great note to wrap it on. That's like where CCL is too. That there is definitely going to have to be some emphasis and focus on building out the transmission necessary to get this clean energy where it needs to be, and for us to reduce emissions at the pace we need to reduce them at. So I think we definitely agree with that assessment. Well, thank you so much. We've hit our 45-minute mark, and I don't want to abuse your time. Thank you for joining us today. This was a terrific conversation, and I'm confident that our volunteers really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it immensely, and I just want to reiterate my thanks. I know from long experience of seeing and working with people at CCL everywhere just how many million hours of labor have been put in over the decade of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And I really do want to just tell people that all that effort has been one of the reasons that we've been able to kind of change the conversation and the climate around climate. And that's been truly significant work. And look forward to many collaborations going forward. God bless y'all. Take care.
Thank you so much, Bill. I know that means a ton to our volunteers and to everybody on CCL staff. Thank you for all that you do and for your support. Well, thanks again, everybody. Here are some brief reminders on where you can find today's recordings, as well as Bill's Twitter and his Substack, more about Third Act. And if you'd like to get involved, you can get involved with Third Act at that link. We'll be back for our next event in the series in early 2023. Stay tuned for seeing who we'll have join us. And thanks again, Bill, and for all that Third Act's doing. And stay safe and be well, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.